As far as the Cold War, 1983, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, a plan to develop space-based weapons to protect America from attacks by Soviet nuclear missiles. Reagan's plan for the Cold War was to bring it to an end by challenging the Soviet Union to a spending race, one that the Soviets could not hope to win. Reagan hoped to simply spend them into non-existence, and with a stronger economy, it was very possible. Besides the SDI, there was also the development of new military hardware, including the B-1 bomber, new missiles, and new naval warships. Now, Congress didn't spend all the money that Reagan was asking for, but defense spending during Reagan's administration, especially in his second term, doubled, which added to the deficit. During his second term, Reagan formed a diplomatic relationship with the reform-minded Mikhail Gorbachev, who would become the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev was interested in advancing reform and embraced the ideas of glasnost, which means openness or an end to restrictions on political freedoms, as well as perestroika, which was a restructuring of the economy by including some elements of capitalism or free market practices into the Soviet economy. In 1987, the Americans and the Soviets signed a historic agreement to eliminate intermediate-range nuclear missiles. That same year, Reagan spoke at Germany's Berlin Wall, a symbol of communism and division since it had been built in 1961, and famously challenged Mikhail Gorbachev to tear it down, saying, quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 29 months later, Gorbachev allowed the people of Berlin to dismantle the wall. After leaving the White House, Reagan returned to Germany in September of 1990, just weeks before Germany was officially reunified, and took several symbolic swings with the hammer at a remaining chunk of the wall. For his role in bringing about better communications with the Soviet Union and ultimately an end to the Cold War, Reagan would be known as the Great Communicator. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist, as it broke up into smaller, independent republics. 1988 was once again an election year, and Reagan was now just the second president to serve 2 full terms since the 22nd Amendment had been ratified back in 1951. His vice president, George H.W. Bush, was nominated by the Republican Party. Challenging him was the Democratic governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. Bush won the election largely by promising not to raise taxes. As he put it, "Read my lips, no new taxes," a statement that would come back to haunt him. Bush captured 426 electoral votes and more than 53% of the popular vote to Dukakis's 111 electoral votes, and Dukakis did finish with more than 45% of the vote, as there were several minor candidates involved too. But despite the continued Republican administration, both the House and the Senate were Democrat-controlled. A key focus of Bush's presidency was foreign policy. He began his time in the White House as Germany was in the process of reunifying after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Soviet Union was collapsing, and the Cold War was ending. Many of the former Eastern Bloc nations were foregoing communism and embracing Western-style democracies and economies. Bush would also be credited with helping to improve U.S.-Soviet relations. He met with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and in July of 1991, the two men signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. In China, the 1980s had brought a series of reforms as well, much like in the Soviet Union, that had decreased the role of the state in the economy. By the late 1980s, proponents of various liberties, human rights, and government reforms, such as the separation of powers, began to be debated on university campuses, and students began demonstrating against the slow pace of reform. By 1989, there were several major demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, culminating in the government instituting martial law and crushing the protests. One of the most iconic photos of the century was taken in June of 1989 as a lone protester, whose identity and fate are unknown, faced off against a line of tanks in Tiananmen Square. The U.S. and other Western nations strongly disapproved of the military actions against protesters, and relations with China grew more distant for a time, although there were no demands for sanctions or military response to the incident. Bush also authorized military operations in Panama and the Persian Gulf. In December of 1989, the United States invaded Panama and overthrew the nation's corrupt dictator Manuel Noriega, who was threatening the security of Americans who lived there and trafficking drugs to the United States. Perhaps Bush's biggest foreign policy issue came after Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein launched an invasion and occupation of Kuwait in August of 1990 and threatened to invade Saudi Arabia, which, if successful, would give him control of one-fifth of the world's oil supply. The United Nations instituted a retaliatory embargo that had little effect, but also began preparing a military force dubbed Operation Desert Shield in preparation for a possible invasion. Although the United Nations was involved, it was chiefly an American affair, led by U.S. generals, including Norman Schwarzkopf, nicknamed Stormin' Norman, and Colin Powell. The military coalition of more than 30 countries then began an air assault against Iraq in mid-January 1991, dubbed Operation Desert Storm. After 5 weeks of the air offensive and 100 hours of a ground offensive, Operation Desert Storm ended in late February with Iraq's defeat and Kuwait's liberation. The Iraqi army began surrendering in droves, and Saddam Hussein withdrew from Kuwait, though he was left in power in Iraq to stabilize the region. But Iraq did not leave Kuwait untouched. Millions of dollars of valuables were plundered by the occupying troops, and as Iraqi forces retreated, they detonated explosives at many of Kuwait's oil wells. The disaster to the environment grew as Iraq dumped oil into the Persian Gulf, and it took months to put out the fires and clean up the oil pollution. The costs of this Persian Gulf War were enormous, and the casualty figures overall quite staggering. Although estimates range in the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi deaths, there were only 148 Americans who were killed in the battle. The difference accounted mainly because of the technological advances of the United States military. On the domestic front, Bush was a moderate conservative and signed such important pieces of legislation as the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 and the Clean Air Act amendments that same year. He also made 2 appointments to the U.S. Supreme Court, including Clarence Thomas, whose appointment was somewhat marred by accusations of sexual harassment, though he was approved in 1991. While Bush gained support amongst the American public for his foreign policy initiatives, his popularity at home was marred by an economic recession. After promising no new taxes in his presidential campaign, he upset many Americans by raising tax revenues in an effort to deal with a rising budget deficit, as more than $1 trillion had been added to the national debt during his term. Additional domestic problems plagued the president. In April of 1992, the city of Los Angeles erupted into a 5-day looting and burning rampage that killed more than 50 people and claimed damages nearing $1 billion. The riot having been touched off by the acquittal of 5 Los Angeles police officers for the beating of Rodney King during his arrest in 1991. A hidden camera showed the officers repeatedly beating King with nightsticks while he lay on the ground. Despite the video evidence, the jury found the police officers not guilty of using excessive force. The announcement of the verdict released years of pent-up rage many African Americans felt about the ongoing problem of police brutality. The recession that battered the American economy would not go away. It was due in part to the failing of numerous savings and loans institutions. The deregulation of the Reagan years had encouraged businesses like the S&Ls to make risky decisions that began to backfire after a major stock market crash in 1987. Most were able to hold on for a time, but as they began failing, FDIC insurance, although it meant people's deposits were protected, it meant that taxpayers would be on the hook for the money, a total of about $250 billion. As growth remained low and unemployment persisted, the likelihood that Bush would win a second term was diminishing. Not since James Monroe's second term back in 1820 had a sitting president been elected during an economic slump. Bush faced a significant challenge from two Washington outsiders, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton and Texas billionaire businessman H. Ross Perot. Bush ran on a platform of family values and character because his main challenger had been accused of being a draft dodger, having used drugs, and being a womanizer. Clinton, a baby boomer, focused on the economy as the main issue of the campaign. He promised reform of welfare and health insurance, plus he ran on the issue of the economy. Perot ran as an independent and financed his own campaign. He wanted to eliminate waste, cut government spending, and reduce restrictions on businesses. He emphasized passing on the American dream and planned to balance the budget and break the gridlock in Washington. His campaign was hurt, though, by his decision to withdraw in June of 1992 and then re-enter the race in September. Ultimately, Bush lost his bid for re-election to Clinton, with Clinton winning 370 electoral votes and 43% of the popular vote, while Bush captured just 168 electoral votes and 37.5% of the popular vote. Perot garnered approximately 19% of the popular vote, but got no electoral votes at all. Both houses of Congress also went to the Democratic Party. Clinton's victory marked an end to the domination of politics by the World War II generation. Americans who had come of age during the turbulent 60s and 70s now had a representative of their own in the White House. One of the first major initiatives Clinton began with was healthcare reform. Many Americans were concerned about spiraling medical costs. Medicare, for example, did not cover prescription drugs and only paid a portion of healthcare costs. And over 20 million Americans had no health insurance whatsoever. Clinton assembled a task force to study the problem and assigned his wife Hillary to head the committee. She became the most politically active First Lady since Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s. Eventually, Clinton presented a plan to limit costs and insure each American citizen to the Congress. But powerful interest groups representing doctors and insurance companies were opposed. Many in Congress thought the program was too costly, and conservatives compared the plan to socialized medicine. Despite a friendly Democratic Congress, Clinton's proposal was defeated. As far as other areas of reform, he also signed the Family and Medical Leave Act, allowing individuals to take unpaid time off, guaranteeing their specific job or an equivalent one, in order to care for a family member or themselves in the event of a serious illness, which included both childbirth and adoption. He also got Congress to pass a motor voter law, which would allow people to register to vote when they applied for a driver's license, presumably making it easier for young people to become a part of the political process. He even signed the Brady Bill, placing some restrictions on gun ownership and gun availability, which was inspired by the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan back in 1981 and was named for his press secretary, James Brady, who had been seriously wounded in the attack. Clinton also instituted a don't ask, don't tell policy regarding homosexuals serving in the military. And he also signed the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and helped to form the World Trade Organization in order to reduce barriers on trade, specifically lowering or eliminating tariffs. When the midterm congressional elections took place in 1994, the Republicans thought they had a chance to capture at least one of the two houses of Congress, because it seemed as if the public was losing their trust in the government. Led by Representative Newt Gingrich, Republicans in Congress signed a contract with America. The contract was simply a list of 10 promises that each signatory pledged to pursue if the Republicans won that election. The issues they addressed included congressional term limits and a balanced budget amendment and even a presidential line item veto. Plus, there were stricter penalties for violent criminals, welfare reform, programs to strengthen families, increased defense spending, and reduced government regulations, plus legal reforms for excessive liability claims, frivolous lawsuits, tax cuts, and even an amendment to ban abortion. The strategy worked brilliantly, and the Senate voted a narrow Republican majority. But more astonishing, actually, were the results in the House. The Democrats had controlled the House of Representatives since 1954, and many Republicans had actually gotten used to acting like an opposition party. But when the votes were counted, Republicans had outscored the Democrats in the House, 230 seats to 205. Gingrich would be rewarded for his efforts by being named Speaker of the House. Once in power, the House voted on the issues that the Republicans had campaigned on, although actually only two main issues passed both the House and the Senate. The first was that Congress agreed that laws passed by the House had to apply to members of the House as well as other Americans. And second, that Congress agreed to stop imposing mandated programs on local and state governments without providing corresponding funding. Still, having a Republican-controlled Congress resulted in deep cuts to welfare programs, especially when a 1995 federal shutdown left only the most essential government services running. Clinton also had to deal with terrorism, originating both abroad and at home. Radical Islamic terrorists bombed the World Trade Center in February of 1993, killing 6 and injuring more than 1,000 with a truck bomb placed in the underground parking garage of the North Tower. The reasoning given by the bombers was that it was for retaliation for U.S. aid for Israel in their continued fight against Palestine. The terrorists had hoped that by placing a powerful bomb in the basement of one tower, that they would be able to get it to collapse and bring down the other tower, which might kill as many as 250,000 people in lower Manhattan. But their plan failed when the North Tower remained standing. Not long after, a fiery standoff between federal and state agents and Branch Davidian religious cult members from February to April 1993 occurred in Waco, Texas, and it resulted in the deaths of more than 70 men, women, and children, 21 children in all. The government was serving search warrants related to possible drug manufacturing and child abuse accusations. A government investigation claims that the fires that destroyed much of the compound and accounted for most of the deaths were started by cult members. The survivors were sentenced to lengthy prison terms on various federal charges, but it was a significant blow to the Clinton administration. And finally, an American terrorist named Timothy McVeigh used a truck bomb to blow up a federal building in Oklahoma City in April of 1995, killing 169 people, including more than a dozen children at the building's daycare. He claimed that he bombed the building in retaliation for the U.S. government's raid on the Branch Davidian compound 2 years later. Eventually, he would be convicted and executed. Then in January 1998, a scandal that nearly ended Clinton's presidency began to unfold in the press. There had already been accusations about questionable land sales and investments that resulted in the so-called Whitewater scandal, and there were questions about sexual harassment of female workers when he was the governor of Arkansas. This had resulted in a lawsuit and the required deposition under oath and an eventual financial settlement. This time, though, it was different. It was reported that Clinton had engaged in a sexual relationship with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky during his first term in office. Although he originally denied the charges, including under oath in the deposition for that earlier lawsuit, overwhelming evidence was presented that Clinton and Lewinsky had engaged in repeated sexual contact, even in the Oval Office. Republicans were outraged. An independent counsel named Kenneth Starr was appointed to gather evidence against Clinton. As the summer ended, Clinton admitted that many of the reports were true and that he was ashamed of his behavior. The House Judiciary Committee drew up articles of impeachment on 4 counts, including abuse of power and obstruction of justice for lying under oath. Across the nation, Americans debated whether or not Clinton's misbehavior constituted an impeachable offense. The House decided that 2 articles of impeachment were in order. In December 1998, Clinton would join Andrew Johnson as the only other president to be impeached. But in such proceedings, the Senate ultimately has the final word and acts as a judge and jury. 2/3 of the senators must vote guilty to remove a president from office. But Clinton survived this final vote to impeach, which unfolded purely along party lines, and the Republicans could only get 50 out of 100 votes. And remember, they need 67. Now, in 1996, had been an election year for Clinton, and he had run against Bob Dole and H. Ross Perot, who once again ran as an independent, and he had won that election 379 to 159. But the House and the Senate had remained in Republican hands. In the year 2000, Clinton was termed out, and the Democratic Party chose his vice president, Al Gore, as their candidate. He had tried to distance himself from the Clinton scandals, while at the same time he clung to the prosperity of the Clinton administration. The Green Party launched a serious campaign, nominating consumer advocate Ralph Nader to head a party mostly made up of liberals and environmentalists. The Republicans chose George W. Bush, son of former President George H.W. Bush. The budget surplus and what to do with it was the main topic of debate during the election. Bush wanted to institute tax cuts for all, while Gore wanted to provide tax cuts only for the middle class and use the rest for Social Security, Medicare, and paying down the national debt. Overall, Nader drew little support, but those votes were generally from the most liberal and therefore may have affected Democratic support. It turned out to be a close election, as was expected, but the extreme closeness in the state of Florida mandated a recount according to state law, as Bush was leading by very few votes. A recount upheld the votes, but some still questioned the results because the Florida governor at the time was Jeb Bush, George Bush's brother, and the official in charge of certifying the election had been appointed by Jeb Bush. A lawsuit eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which ordered a recount to stop and the results to stand. Overall, the popular vote went to Gore by about 500,000, but the electoral count went to Bush, 271 to 266, and he only needed 270 to win.